I want to say an immense thank you to our father, our great leader in the struggle of African liberation and the emancipation of our minds. I want to say a big thank you on behalf of the Movement of the People and the Nigeria Resistance Movement to Dr. Wade Nobles. Thank you very much, sir, for honoring us with your presence.
I'm glad to be here, and I'm hoping this technology won't cripple us. I'm trying to get my screen to show it. Okay.
So, good afternoon to our distinguished guests, and good evening to our home members here in Nigeria, members of the Movement of the People, members of NRM, Nigeria Resistance Movement. My name is Sean Kwabukuti, and I have the rare honor and privilege to introduce a great African to you all in the name and person of Dr. Wade W. Nobles. He also has a few African names. Ifagbemi Sangodare, Nana Kweku Beko, Bejana Umbone.
Yes.
He's a custodian of...
Yes, okay.
He's a custodian of great African history with parents and grandparents who experienced slavery and socio-political and economic oppression in the American society. Baba Dr. Wade Ifagbemi Sangodare is Professor Emeritus in Africana Studies and Black Psychology at San Francisco State University, a founding member and past president 1994 to 95 of the Association of Black Psychologists and the founder and executive director, retired, of the Institute for the Advanced Study of Black Family, Life and Culture, Inc. in Oakland. Dr. Noble's professional career as a teacher, researcher, academician, and scholar/activist has been a consistent and formal engagement in the ongoing theoretical and programmatic development and restoration of the African mind and worldwide liberation of African people. He is the author of over 100 articles, chapters, research, reports, and books, the co-author of the seminal article in Black Psychology, Voodoo or IQ, an introduction to African psychology, and the author of Seeking the Shaku, Foundational Writings in African Psychology, an anthology of over 30 years of Africa-centered research and scholarship, and his newest manuscript, The Island of Names, Haiti's Unfinished Revolution, which was described by Dr. Theophile Obenga as perhaps the most important book of the last 5 decades. Dr. Noble has lectured in Ghana, South Africa, England, Haiti, Cuba, and served as a visiting professor in Salvador de Bahia and Sao Paulo, Brazil. He was initiated into the Ifa spiritual system at Osogbo, Nigeria in 1992, and received the high honor of being installed as the Nkwashoni Development Chief, that is, of Akwashio Kwau region of Ghana, West Africa in 1996. He and his wife, Dr. Vera L. Nobles, have 5 children and 13 grandchildren. Dr. Nobles currently serves as the chairperson of the ABP Pan-African Black Psychology Global Initiative. Perhaps I implore you all listening to me, wherever you might be right now, to please join me in welcoming Dr. Nobles into our midst with an applause.
Yes, I want to thank you, Sheon, for inviting me to speak before my family in Nigeria, my children's children, and I want to thank my daughter Zetha for introducing me to you. And I'm glad that we are now connected, and if I can serve you well, I'd like to present some ideas around the question of the liberation of the African mind through a PowerPoint, and hopefully have some time to engage family in some conversation about what they have just heard. I'm going to go to my, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So if it give me back permission, I will move forward. Okay, I hope to talk about, as requested, this question of the liberation of the African mind, and I'm going to do that in a particular way. I want to first talk about my definition of power, and then suggest some thoughts coming from Dr. Jake Carruthers and Asa Hilliard and Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, and then share with you what I see as the need to understand and eliminate the psychological effects of colonization and chattelization, And from that point, introduce some new conversation about an African grand narrative, an African cosmos, an African reverberating episteme, and the African idea of what it means to be human, which is spiritness in my work. And finally, I would like to suggest some couple of strategies that might be useful in rescuing and liberating the African mind, and end with us having some collaborative conversation about what I've just shared. In the beginning of my work as a Black psychologist, I offered the question of what is power, because too often we have looked at power as guns and machines, and felt almost impotent to the power of the Western world with its machinery. And I suggested that it wasn't the machinery, but it was ideas, and that power is the ability. Excuse me just for a moment. What?
By your ear. There.
You see that? I apologize. I just had to do some restructuring this room so I could be able to concentrate on what I'm saying. What I began to point out to everyone is that power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. Part of our problem is that psychologically, other people have defined what is the African reality. And once we've accepted that, they have power over us. And so I also note that the most important reality to define is the meaning of one's human beingness. That's the fundamental question in my mind. What does it mean to be a human being for African people? J. Carruthers, a major scholar and thinker in the United States, has said African scholars and practitioners must break the chains that link African ideas to European ones and listen to the voice of our ancestors without European interpretation. He goes on to say, ultimately, knowing is the result of a divine, universal, and intergenerational conversation among the God, among the creator, among the cosmos. Wait for someone, whoever's giving me background music. I'm not singing, so I don't need a background music team. Okay? If they're muted, I appreciate it. That the ultimately knowing is the result of a divine, universal, and intergenerational conversation among God, the creator, the cosmos, nature, and the creatures of the earth, especially human beings. Asa Hilliard, a major thinking in Association of Black Psychologists, has said it is time to take charge of our tools, our problem definitions, our priorities, and to change directions. It is time to reach for excellence. We must have a mission to assume greater responsibility and control over our children's socialization and to push for education for critical consciousness. And finally, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah said, I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. I would stop right there and say us to resonate on that thought that Africa is in us wherever African people find themselves throughout the world. And we got to illuminate that understanding and not see these nation states or the geographical places preventing us from being African and a united Africa. Kwame says, all people of African descent, whether they live in North or South America, the Caribbean, or any part of the world, are Africans and belong to the African nation. It is clear we must find an African solution to our problems can only be found in African unity. Divided, we are weak. United, Africa could become one of the greatest forces for good in the world. And we have to resonate on these guiding thoughts as I move forward through this discussion. I'm gonna go forward. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay. So I want to speak two things that I think are the twin evils that affect the African everywhere in the world: colonization and what people called our Western enslavement, but it really was a process of chattelization, of owning human beings, of making us property that we could be bought, sold, given away, and inherited. And colonization was about the rearrangement of a people's relationship to the land, and a people's relationship to their own mind. So those two things, the rearrangement of our minds and our being defined as chattel, are the twin evils that have never been addressed or affected or corrected. Colonization in 1885, the European powers, you all know this, I know, that Belgium, Italy, Great Britain, Portugal, France, Germany, Holland got together and set up and simply took a crayon and carved up Africa on a map and took pieces of it as if they were owning it, and made the map of Africa properties for each imperial nation to rule, to control, and to own its people. The avaricious and arbitrary dissection of Africa resulted in and still is happening, endless conflicts of situations due to torn loyalties. Africans feeling they are more British than Britain, more French than French, more Portuguese than Portuguese, and then engaging in atrocities toward each other based on these ethnic pluralities. Colonization led to an endless cycle of state dysfunctioning and human misery, where the world now mocks Africa, say Africa is so undeveloped, they have no rulership, they have no civil society, that we're problem laden, and don't acknowledge that it was the colonial invasion of Africa that the results have been this state dysfunctioning and the human misery we see throughout Africa. And you all know that the Belgian Congo, King Leopold was such a savage person that he actually believed he could own a whole country and own all the people in that country and all the resources of that country. And it results through this one single savage person, the Democratic Republic of Congo was reduced by 50%. Imagine the horror of that 50% of a population were destroyed at the will of this one single European, I'm saying savage, but you can call them what you want. And then chattelization was not our enslavement. The language we use is important. It really was not our enslavement, meaning that we were locked up and made to work for somebody else. It was the chattelization of us. There is little recorded in human history to compare to this sheer horror. The enslavement experience was an experience of dehumanizing people, not making them work for free. 300 years of transatlantic slave trade amounted to a massive system of death and destruction beyond human comprehension and convention. We still can't put our minds around what really happened during that enslavement period. It's unparalleled in any annals of history. Chattelization made the enslaved human being a movable piece of property. Humans were now movable pieces of property equivalent to a goat or a cow or a pig or a sheep. Chattel slavery, in effect, attempted to dehumanize the African human being. This human derailment was experienced at the personal level as psychic terror and physical torture at the personal level, but it affected the entire population of African people. It was fueled by the ideology of white supremacy. The rise of European capitalism directly influenced the slave trade, and American plantation colonies grew and prospered using us as a permanent labor force, a permanent owned piece of property. This mindset didn't fall out the sky, didn't just show up one day in the world of human affairs. It was created out of the minds of particular Western philosophers and aristocrats, and I pick out two to point out. George Hegel. Hegel is a major thinker in Western thought, and he's sort of the root foundation for much of the socialist and Marxist theories that we play around today. But let's look at what Hegel does. Hegel says that colonialism and slave trade were preordained manifestation of God's will. He's not saying it's evil white folks doing this. He's saying this is God's will. He said the African is the stuff of nature existing beyond the pale of civilized society. he permanently places us in the underbelly of human society. He says, we are trapped in this self-repeating cycle, incapable of the sensitivities required to actualize our potentiality. So Africa has now become the permanent stepchild of humanity that we have to look for others to help us, to guide us. Hegel goes on to say, at this point, we leave Africa, not to mention it again, for Africa is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. What we properly understand by Africa is the unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still evolved in the conditions of mere nature, and which had to be presented here only as the threshold of world history. This one simple thinker took Africa out of the conversation of human progress. He removes us from an understanding of natural development. Gobineau, a French aristocrat, adds to that, and he says that human progress went from African primitivism to European civility. So there's this linear polarity where Africa's on the bottom and European is on the top. Gobineau goes on to say, somehow there must be a substantial difference between the white and the Negro man. I like this phraseology because Europeans do this a lot. They make it I'm wondering about this when they know they're evil. Is I wonder that somehow there must be this substantial difference between white and Negro man. He said the difference is a direct result of the difference in conditions in Africa and in Europe. He said the humans in Europe had to use their brains to overcome their problems, while the humans in Africa had hardly any need to use their potential skills. He says, like Europeans who were struggling with the environment, so they used their brains, with Africa would sit around on the beach. There was mango trees and bananas and pawpaw and fish, and we didn't do nothing but just reach up and hold our hand out and let a banana fall down and we eat it. So we didn't have to figure out, use our minds to do anything. He says, this is the explanation why the Negroes are still quite undeveloped, while the Caucasians have been able to use their intelligence to build an impressive civilization. Now look at this time, this is 1700s, 1800s. These people are framing a mental mindscape of the relationship between Africa and Europe. And then in terms of psychology, I'm a psychologist, so I want to bring up their evil as well. Just remember, colonialism is a rearrangement of our relationship to the land and a rearrangement of our relationship to the mind. Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and G. Stanley Hall are the founding, literally, gods of psychology. They're the main foundational thinkers for psychology. But what do they say about Africa? Sigmund Freud believed that Black people were of the three lowest forms of human beings. He referenced his practice and behaviors of African peoples as being savage and primitive. Whenever he talked about African people, he used this nomenclature: savagery, primitive. He believed in Darwin's justification of the primal horde theory, and he referred to his patients, because he had this belief in, as a clinician, that the therapist was high and the patient was low. He called his patients his Negroes. Now, this is the learned genius of Western psychology. He equated the therapist-patient relationship with the equivalent of the master-slave relationship. Carl Jung comes along and suggests that he believed that there were certain psychological maladies found amongst Americans which were due to the presence of Black people. Jung is saying that white Americans have these psychological maladies just by being around Black folk. We just like this sort of contagion. You get near us and we drive you crazy. We have to think about that, but some of this craziness that white folks get may be due to some stuff where they're trying to mimic our godness and don't realize that they're trying to mimic godness. He noted that the cause of the American energetic sexual repression could be found in the specific American complex, namely living together amongst lower races, especially those Negroes. Now, these are two Europeans coming out of Europe making commentary about what's going on in America. He says living together with barbaric races exerts a suggestive effect on the tame instincts of the white race. He also was, those of you who know psychology, he was the dream therapist, and he talked about dreams and knowing from your dreams. He also got this, I should point out, he did some traveling in Africa and spoke to African shaman and learned about this underworld called dreaming, or the dream time from Africans, but he never gave us credit for his supposedly genius. He was terrified of becoming Black, and his most critical dreams were, he dreamt that one day he was in Harlem in a barbershop having a haircut. Now, you know, only Negroes go to Harlem, only Negroes in Harlem, only Black people in Harlem, only Black people get their haircut in Harlem, but he thought he may be, in fact, Black himself. G. Stanley Hall, the third of these folk, argued that Africans, Indians, and Chinese were members of an adolescent race and were stuck in a stage of incomplete growth. Now, look what the framework they're doing in terms of our mindscape, of rearranging our minds. When you think about Africa, you think about Asians, you think about Indians, you think about adolescent races that are stuck in this incomplete growth. And he developed something called the recapitulation theory, where he says societies recapitulate from savagery to civility, and humans do the same thing. Children are born as almost savagery, and they have to be socialized to be proper human beings. He goes on to give some rationale to the dangers of Africans having freedom. Think about that. He's saying there's danger, psychologically, there's danger in Africans being free, that we have to make sure that they stay under our control. He headed the Congo reform movement, which was the attempt by the international community to recognize the Belgian King Leopold II's ownership of the Congo. And Leopold II's ownership of the Congo led to the unbelievable atrocities of killing African people, men and women, in order to take control of the rubber trees. So this is a contestation of these grand narratives. The Western, which is the source of colonialism and channelization, and what I'm now posing as an African, which is the source of liberating the African mind. The Western grand narrative comes out of the Greco-Roman Judeo-Christian traditions, but they're speaking to what is real, being matter, being only the physical. They're knowing coming out of their mythologies around Genesis and around meaning of human being. The intellectual mindscape, which emphasizes difference, aristocracy, elitism, classism, racism, sexism, genetic inferiority, caste attribution, whereas now I'm posing on the right side of your screen the African narrative, which should come out of the Kemet, which you all might know as Egypt, the Kemet, Nubian, Bantu, Congo worldviews, which speaks to reality as being both visible and invisible, that the spirit is the meaning of everything, energy is the meaning of everything. Our knowing framework has to be interrogated around our Genesis stories, our creation stories, our meaning of being human, our concept of life and death, and our intellectual mindscape has to focus on issues like commonality, centeredness, transformation, transcendence, improvisation, inspiration, nomo, the power of the word. All these have to be seen as how we make meaning. We start with our own epistemic reflections, our paradigmatic framework, our skill sets, and we give voice to expressing of our essence that leads to a narrative. And I'm going to argue through this, that this right side of this schema is where we should find ourselves in our discussions. So the rearrangement of the African spirit really can be seen in terms of the colonization of psychic space. You see that happening on Africa throughout time, and I'll show you a moment what it looks like, and the shattering of African consciousness and fractured Black identity. You see that throughout the diaspora, where consciousness and identity are inextricably connected, but our consciousness is defined by non-African people and not by our own ancestral sensibilities. The sense of human integrity for African people worldwide, the sense of our human integrity was ruptured by the violation of the psyche relationship to space, time, energy, mobility, bonding, and identity. It was violence and terror that were used as instruments of oppression and exploitation, violence and terror, to the point that we internalize that same strategy and we perpetuate violence and terror on each other, sometimes in little gang warfares in America with gang groups, sometimes in nation states, sometimes within a state where we engage in the destruction of each other, almost to the point of genocide. And so the psychological effects of colonialism and channelization seems to me take on varying forms in the political disenfranchisement, and that those of us who are struggling with political action and political and trying to develop action movements in terms of our own communities have to recognize this, I believe. Political disenfranchisement, economic exploitation, social denigration, and Black on Black death and destruction. And we have to take some ownership of these things because we've been infected Now we've been infected by the European mindset. That doesn't mean we have to continue with this infection, with this syndrome of colonial and chattel negation and nullification, negation. We are the negative of any scheme of process with a negative end or nullification. We are nothing in the eyes of the world. And so people make mockery of Africa and mockery of African people throughout the world because they've been contaminated by these thinkers I just laid out to you. It results in varied forms. The lack of stable infrastructure denies countries from controlling their own resources. Now you can look at Nigeria, look at Ghana, look at Ethiopia, look at any country you want on the continent. Look at the lack of stable infrastructure, which denies our countries from controlling our own resources. Big business call the shots. Multinational corporations call the shots. An unquestionable reliance on outside aid from Western countries. Think about what that means for our liberation of African mind. Over-dependence on the World Bank to manage internal resources and development. Addiction to anything non-African, especially white thought. Africans everywhere in the world, if they get some resources, I just saw this on television. Someone was asked, you won this lotto, what you gonna do? Well, I think I'll take a vacation to Europe. I gotta go to Paris. Or someone says, I need to hide out. I need to go away. I'm gonna go hide myself in a foreign country. How can you as a Black person be invisible in a white country? But see, the mind is so distorted that we don't recognize it. Addiction to anything non-African, indefensible admiration for white privilege and power. We defend them in their power position. Racelessness, talking about displacing anger and aggression and self-hate. A constant sense of depression where we see ourselves as either depressed or deluded about we are personally responsible for our condition, and not that there's a systemic social societal system that is affecting us. This mental self-medication by denial of African worth. And we see Black folks all over the world. So I've traveled around the world, and I see the same thing happening where Black people self-medicate by saying, I'm not African, I'm an individual. I'm not Igbo, I'm an individual. I'm not Nigerian, I'm not really my state, I'm an individual. And then finally, this individualism becomes the antidote to being African. I won't be an African, but I can be an individual. And there's no conscious sense of the meaning of what it means to be African for African people. And so I asked the question to myself as I was preparing for this, and I said, if we have been rearranged by enslavement and colonization, what was our arrangement before the rearrangement? We start with Europeans' history. We don't ask ourselves, what were we like before that? I'm going to argue with you argue in a good sense, that we are the ancestors. We right now in this room are the ancestors. And that we can see our long historical walk, a mighty walk, beginning with the first known humanoid that recently was this woman named Dinkwanesh. The archaeologists found that they said, oh, we can call her Lucy, like Lucy in the Sky, a Beatles song. But the Africans who were part of that, they said, no, this body, this woman, she should be called Dinkwanesh. Think about that moment. I see the oldest form of humanity in the known world. The white folks call her Lucy. The Black folks say, this is a wonder. My mother, you are a wonder. And then later they found remains older than her, and they called him the big man, Kadunumu, 3.8 million years old. The two oldest specimens of humanity is a Black woman and a Black man. Everyone else comes later. So we to look at this and realize again, white folks called him big man. I would suspect that if I were there, I'd say that's Big Daddy or Papa, because our language says something about the relationship. And just as a mnemonic, as a symbolic representation, look at if we put our time on this planet as human beings in a 24-hour clock, we would see that classical African civilization is like 14 hours of the day. Traditional African civilization is 7 hours a day. The European invasion of Africa, starting with the The Berlin Conference is about 52 minutes. Our enslavement in the West is about 1 minute and 24 seconds. Our attempt to reconstruct ourselves is 11 seconds long. The major moment of our rebirth, called the Harlem Renaissance, was 24 seconds, 24 minutes. The Civil Rights Movement, 10 minutes. The Black Power Movement, 17 minutes. The hip hop that we're now in is only 9 minutes long. And this whole post-racial society stuff that started with conversation with the presidents of Barack Obama is 2 minutes long. So if we look at this chart and think about it, that what we are dealing with now as our primary reality is a small period of time in our human clock. We have spent more time in classical African civilization than all the time starting with the invasion. So why do we look at the invasion of Africa, the enslavement of Africa, as defining who we are, and not go back and look at how we walked in the world before the invasion? That's just for you to think about. So I think that the voices of our knowing and knowable spirit has to come about, and I'm using this term called divine energy made manifest, or DEM, D-E-M-M, which I will work with you in a moment. But look at this, African philosophy before the arrangement. Our understanding of the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and spirit, what I'm calling divine energy made manifest, across the continent. In Kemet, Nubia, to be human is to be spirit. They use the term nu. In the Yoruba land in Nigeria, to be human is to be spirit. They call DEM, divine energy made manifest, Orisha Na, expression of spirit. And the Mindi of Sierra Leone, human is to be spirit. The Bantu Congo in Central Africa, to be human is to be spirit. The Akan in Ghana, to be human is to be spirit. The Lebo in Senegal, to be human is to be spirit. The Zulu in South Africa, to be human is spirit. Everywhere when we stop looking at, as Jake says, to look at African world without being filtered through European thought, everywhere we look at Africa with African eyes, Africa says we are spirit beings. To be humans, to be spirit, not to be this more stuff that Europe put on us. And this is just to look at the fact that if you look at our episteme has to do with knowing, how you know. Everywhere we find African people, there's an interchange back and forth across time and space. It's not linear going from old time to new time, it goes back and forth. The alligator swamp with the Haitian Revolution, the Bantu expansion throughout Africa, the Nile Valley experience, the Sapelo Islands in Georgia, the Gullah people in South Carolina, the Saramaka in Suriname, the Dismal Swamp in Virginia, the Congo Basin Bantu, the Quilombos in Brazil, the Campo in Jamaicans and Maroon, the Savannah River Basin in Georgia. We see an exchange of African thought and being that's sort of there, but we don't acknowledge it and represent it because we're looking at ourselves through African eyes. I love this proverb that God prepared the fufu, and we human beings are its condiments. We the seasoning. But what kind of seasoning do we use in understanding our world? And this is just a schema to point out that for at least in the United States, that we can now trace our ancestral lineages across the Yoruba, the Bantu, the Dogon, the Congo, the Luba, the Wolof, the Ewe, the Asante, the Jola, the Temne, the Mandi, the Zulu, the Bambara, and all of those are streams of thought that come into an African-American understanding of our cultural customs, our virtues, our laws, our values, our themes, our prerequisites, but we have not lifted them up and given them the respect they're due as we talk about how we live in the world. But they're sort of in the underbelly. So the question becomes liberating the African mind. How do we do that? I am suggesting that the key to the liberation of the African mind might be found in the SAKU, or Pan-African Black Psychology. Now that might be because I'm a psychologist, maybe a historian might come with some other ideas, but think about it. In Black psychology, I introduced the concept of Saku Sheti as a further refinement, and Saku Sheti comes out of ancient Kemet. So I'm going way beyond the invention of white psychology. That Saku Sheti is a further refinement of the deep extension of Black psychology's African essence. This process recognizes that the full understanding of reality acknowledges that spirit, energy, force, power is the basis of all known and knowable perceptions. Saku Sheti is penetrating search, study, and understanding that requires an investigative approach that seeks a deeper meaning of phenomena and explores the invisible aspects of reality. The goal of the Saku Pan-African psychology is to always seek and achieve a deeper insight into every aspect of the real and the unreal, the visible and the invisible, by engaging in a deep, profound, and penetrating search, study, understanding, and mastery of the process of illuminating the human spirit. And we do that by, one, clarifying our definition, meaning, and resolute position and purpose in the world. That's a big job, to clarify our definition, our meaning, and our position in the world. We are not holding our hands out asking for something. We are, in fact, the owners of our own destiny. Analyze and describe the concrete human conditions which affect and influence our collective human development. Now, you can take Nigeria, you can take Mississippi, you can take anywhere in the world and ask ourselves, what is our human condition, and how does that human condition affect and influence our collective development and our consciousness? Prescribe and excite solutions. That's when we become activists, we become action-oriented. How do we prescribe and excite solutions and actions that will free African people from both their material and spiritual degradation? And so the liberation of the African mind, now I'm not being poetic here, but I want to use this kind of language. The liberation of the African mind requires us to see with ancestral eyes, to see with ancestral eyes. We have to see, use our language, our narrative, our voice as defined by our ancestral inspiration. Languaging, to borrow and use of alien language is the first tool of communication, is the most dangerous step we can do. Even though I'm speaking to you in English, you all hear me in English, the borrowing of Euro-American language is a problematic. When we prioritize the English language, English as a language of communication, we carry the weight of Greco-Roman, Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, Euro-American culture and civilization. When we speak the English language, we're carrying their cultural civilization. So we have to interrogate that and ask, what's the deeper meaning of the words we're using to communicate our experiences? Bobby Wright, a Black psychologist, one of our former Black psychologists, coined the term menticide. He said, menticide is the attempt to kill our minds that results in a mental incapacity to think freely. We've all been assaulted by this menticidal assault to kill our ability to have the mental capacity to think freely. And some South American Black Afro psychologists created the term epistemicide, which says epistemicide is the attempt to murder our ability to even know. So we got to think about these things and look at what I'm suggesting is the Western grand narrative, which I spoke earlier, is cultural violence. This cultural violence. So we can't, even though we're embedded in it and we talk about it, we study it, we go to schools and our curriculums are all in European languages, our curriculums are borrowed from the Western world. All these things are cultural violence that we have to interrogate if we're going to keep from allowing them to destroy us. The African Black narrative, the Kemet, Nubian, Bantu, Congo narrative, I'm suggesting what we need to embrace and begin to look at that in terms of spirit, consubstantiation. We are all of the same stuff. We're all of the same substance. So there's nowhere in the African world I do not belong. There's nowhere in the African world you do not belong. And you have to simply claim that African world as your place. The cosmos for Africans speaks differently than what we're trained in the West. There are realms of reality. Reality consists of the invisible and the visible, with the invisible being far greater than the visible. Again, we have to ponder about that. Reality consists of the visible world and the invisible world, with the invisible world being far greater than the visible. The visible realm is the macrocosm of the immediate perceptual world. That's what we walk around bumping to, talk about, get upset because the traffic in Lagos is difficult. All that's the visible stuff. The invisible realm is the mesocosmos, is the intermediate world of spirits, of the malevolent and malevolent and benevolent forces. The macrocosmos is the world beyond our senses, the realm of the divine, the ancestors, the spirit beings. So reality, real reality, is that for African thought, The universe is matter in appearance and spirit in reality. It is, some ways people say it is the physical world is an illusion. The universe is matter in appearance and spirit in reality. Reality is non-localized, immutable, and eternal spirit. The material universe is only the perception of reality. That's important for us to think about, because when we start bowing down to the physical power of our oppressors, we have to recognize that that is an appearance. The real power is in our spirit and our energy. African epistemology imprints the natural centrality of the role of the divine and of the spirit in the acquisition of knowing. We are spirit. We are spirit beings. We are, and I'm gonna say this slowly, we are not human beings. We are spirit beings housed in a physical container having a human experience. We are spirit beings housed in a physical container having a human experience. We can change that human experience. We can even modify our physical container. Some folks go around putting bleaching cream on their skin. And when I went to Ghana, there were all these big ads for bleaching cream for Black folk to change their color, their skin tone to be lighter. So we can change our physical container. We can change our physical human experience even by revolution or by negotiation. What we can't change is our spiritness. So we have to know that spirit being in order to use it in a proper way. Again, we are spirit beings housed in a physical container having a human experience. And so the question of this liberating the African mind has to do with the decolonization and mental liberation. In terms of liberating the African mind, the task for us, it seems to me, is to free our minds in scaffolding ways, in a scaffold way, that the mental terrain of African consciousness and Black identity has to be addressed by what J. Carruthers called critical consciousness, wherein we can stimulate a reawakening from the amnesia resulting in hegemonic European Western grand narrative. We have to reawaken, we have to wake up from the amnesia of their thought through critical consciousness. We have to reimagine the world, wherein we give the opportunity to draw upon a different episteme, to draw upon an African episteme, and to unleash the knowing of an African spirit, unleash the knowing of an African spiritness. And this experience directly enables us to engage in alternative counter-ideological visions of how we should be. And finally, to reconciling the intersect, wherein one task is to be responsible for creating new understandings of the perceived differences, the social categories we have inherited from white folk, the tendencies of arrogance and aristocracy and elitism. We have to reconcile those intersects. In the decolonization of the African mind, somebody's speaking. I hope that's not on my side. And maybe that's the ancestors applauding us from the invisible realm, saying, pay attention, pay attention. You get to realize what the symbolisms are. In terms of liberation of the African mind, the task of freeing our minds has to do with understanding that we are spirit beings. And as spirit beings, we are trifold, unfolding, radiating, vibrating energy. There's a lot of mouth here. We are trifold, unfolding, vibrating, radiating energy of yet to live, living, and after living that are linked to a living sun possessing a knowing and knowable spirit, through which we have an enduring relationship with everything, a enduring relationship with the total perceptible and ponderable universe. We just have not stood up and said, as a spirit being, what does my spirit know? What is the knowing and knowable spirit energy? As yet to live spirit beings, we are full possibilities and unlimited potentials. Yet to live, those of us that are yet to be born. Every child, every African child in the womb of his mother has full possibilities and unlimited potential. But we end up limiting that child, unfortunately, by allowing ourselves to be educated by European modalities. But And the child, we come here, we come from heaven with full possibilities and unlimited potential. As living now, I'm living now. We are concentrations of essence manifested for a particular purpose. What is your purpose? Everyone on this call has to interrogate themselves and ask, as a living spirit, as concentrated energy, as manifesting of the divine, what is my purpose? Is my purpose to get an education and leave Nigeria and go to England and say, oh, I finally made it? Is my purpose to get in that queue and hope I get a passport to come to America and say, oh God, I made it? Now, what is our purpose? That's a fundamental question. We are spirit beings housed in a physical container while having a human experience. And then as after living spirits, we are the ancestors. We are the ancestors. We are the ancestors in material form. We are the molecular concentration of the essence of our ancestors. Each and every one of you, including me, my wife, my children, my grandchildren, all of us are our material formation of our ancestral inspirations. What that suggests is that if I am my ancestors, I have come to complete that which is incomplete. Our ancestors didn't complete everything that they came from heaven to do. Our job is to complete that. Maybe our ancestors said we come from heaven to be free, and we are still colonized, we are still enslaved. So my purpose is to complete that which is incomplete, to complete the ancestral inspiration. Some of you know about Moko Jumbi. It's still walkers. I hope you know about it, but still walkers were these men who were dressed in traditional dress and had masks on, and they walked around, and most of the time we see them in carnivals or festivals or in celebrations, and they kick up their legs with these long stilts. But they were called Moko Jumbi. And Moko Jumbi were in fact healing spirit beings that watched over the community from towering heights and were able to see and foresee when evil's coming, when danger's coming, or were able to see when what health needed to be brought to the community. So these stilts they were raised up high. I'm using the Moko Jumbi to suggest something about our consciousness. If we as African raise up our consciousness high through our African consciousness, we can see what is evil. We can see what is where we're being tricked. We can see where the international marketers creating a deal for oil distribution is wrongdoing. We can see these things, and we can also see what's needed to heal and bring and restore our well-being. So I'm saying now I'm gonna take the Moko Jumbi and say one leg, one of those long stilts needs to be engaged in the affirmation of African being. In order to reclaim African affirmation, we have to do certain things. We have to understand what it means to be spirit, the divine energy made manifest. We have to engage in both the visible and invisible realms of reality. We have to honor the feminine as primary and paramount. That third one is so important because we have allowed the Western mind to talk about gender as a duality and this gender equity, and that women have to fight for their rights and they have to be like men in order to be respected. But the African doesn't say that. The African says the feminine is primary and paramount. Nothing comes through the world without coming through the sacred womb of the feminine. So we got to rethink that notion of honoring the feminine as primary and paramount. We have to, in affirming African being and liberating the African mind, we have to understand the sacred meaning of being human. The sacred being, and each of these things you all could take and take either one of them and contemplate and think about what does that mean for how I live in the world today, how I operate in the world today. If I'm a school teacher, if I'm a traffic guard, if I'm a police officer, if I'm a whatever. Look at these things and talk about how do they affect us. Advance human potential and unlimited possibility. Provide opportunities for competence, conscious, and confidence building. Support cultural maturation and spiritual evolution. Create lifespan development from birth to death. Lifespan development and transition, which was after death when you go into the realm of the ancestors. Invent rituals and rites of passage and achievement ceremonies. Defend the right and responsibility. This is an important one for me. Always defend the right and responsibility to walk in the world as a unique and valuable human being with an African face. I ain't gonna do no cosmetic to change my face. My face represents my introduction to the world. And so how do I walk in the world with that unique and valuable face? Protect the cultural character of our ancestral lineage. We need to raise up the ancestors, not on ceremonial time, but to see, I'm sitting in my office right now, and I am my ancestor. I'm here to complete that which was incomplete, and then minimize personal trauma, maximize egalitarian lifestyles, stop the tribal warfare and gang warfare we go through now as one leg of the Moko Jumbi. Second leg of the Moko Jumbi is to directly deal with decolonizing the African mind. To decolonize the African mind, we have to dismantle the edifice of Western hegemony. All our school systems, all our business transactions, all our social things are filtered through a European framework. We even have African people getting married in a white Western ceremony and being proud of the fact that they got their little white wedding gown from France, as if we didn't have no elegant robes, dress to wear to signify this most important moment in my life. Deconstruct the implicit privilege of Western thought. Deconstruct it. Destroy the false image of the white aesthetic. All that is beauty and good is not looks like whiteness. A challenge and correct the singularity of this materialist ontology and engage in the identification and elimination of these dehumanizing systems like institutional oppression, place, classism, disenfranchisement, Western educational pedagogy, Frantz Fanon's notion of thingification, menticide, aristocracy, sexism, colorism, elitism, apostolic authority, individualism, caste systems. All these things are examples of the dehumanizing systems that we have to engage in the elimination of if we are going to liberate the African mind. And then there's something called Zola. Zola is a Bantu Congo term, and it means love. Zola to Angola. Our ancestors knew that being well was in our DNA. We didn't come to be debilitated. We didn't come to be disabled. We didn't come to be sick and infirm. Wellness is in our DNA. And the most stable healing is collective healing. Wade Nobles can't be well if my people are not well, if my family are not well. So it is a collective healing. The goal of healing was for us to love Zola, African people, in order to activate our self-healing potential. The magic, and I use magic in this, not as a sleight of hands, but as understanding the mysteries of the universe. The magic of Zola is that Zola activates our self-healing potential, and in the Bantu Congo, it's called Ngolo. Each of us comes with a capacity to have Ngolo, healing energy that fights infection, that repairs. Think about when you cut your hand, the Ngolo in your body causes your hand to re-heal, to create a scab, to knit itself back together. That's Ngolo in our bodies. We have the capacity to heal, to fight infection, to fight repair, to fight damage, to retard aging. You know, in the United States, we always talk about Black folk don't look old. We take an 80-year-old Black person and an 80-year-old white person. The white person, he's almost dead. The Black person, he better go run a race. Our physicality is such that it retards aging. That's the Ngolo in us, this healing energy. And Zola is the magnetic energy, that's the electrical charge that makes us activate this Ngolo. So Zola is better understood as energy that causes the activation of molecular cellular regeneration. Ngolo. Zola love is the fact that the undeniable desire of one spirit to connect, merge, expand, extend into greater oneness with another spirit. When I fall in love, in the Western model, it's sort of romantic stuff and all these little bells are ringing, but in the African sense, when I fall in love, my Zola activates the Ngola of my wife such that our spirits connect, merge, expand, and extend to a greater oneness. And it's no longer Wade and Vera, it's no longer me and you, it is we. It's that we that is the powerful thing. Zola requires one to value and treasure another with caring affection in order to sustain, promote, nurture, and inspire perfectibility. I would argue that in our political engagements, if we're not engaging in political action because we love African people, then we end up overthrowing the oppressor and replace the oppressor doing the same thing that they did. And we see that in history of Africa. A lot of times our leaders would mimic the Europeans that they overthrew because they weren't engaging in revolutionary action through love, through the activation of our self-healing potential. That's a critique that I am offering. It may or may not be acceptable or true. Zola is the essential act of personal and collective cherishment. Cherishment, I cherish African people. Preservation, I preserve that which African. Actualization, I have to actualize the best of being African. Perfectibility in beingness. So this Zola, this Moko Jumbi, this Moko Jumbi can be seen as a symbol, as an artifact to represent that we might want to be doing the Moko Jumbi dance. We might want to do the Moko Jumbi dance, wherein we kick up the right leg when we have to deal with it, make sure we remind ourselves our task is to affirm African being. Kick up the left leg when remember our task is to deconstruct European hegemony. And a second mind liberation strategy is to reclaim this notion of Baba Agba and Iya Agba. Baba Agba, Iya Agba. When in our tradition, when women enter the community of elders, they take on the role of Iya Agba, which means a senior mother, a warrior mother. It is the Iya Agba who have the primary role as the spiritual protectors of the community. The Iya Agba is the spiritual protector of the community. When men enter the community of elders, they take on the role of Baba Agba, which means they are senior fathers, and more correctly, they are nurturing fathers. So it's not just given from old folks. We all gonna get old, but you can get old and not be a Baba Agba. You can get old and not be an Iya Agba. When you get old and become in a community of elders, you take on a special status that should be revered. When the status of elders, women are devoted, at the status of eldership, women are devoted to protecting and defending. You become warrior mothers, protecting and defending the spiritual balance of the community, of our people. When men take the status of eldership, we don't take it, we're given it by our community. Men are dedicated to securing and establishing, becoming nurturing fathers of the spiritual harmony of the community. Through our warrior mothers and our nurturing fathers, we reestablish the spiritual balance and the spiritual harmony of African community, African being. These are liberation, these can be seen as liberation strategies. How do we translate those into the process of how we govern our group, our process? And this liberation of the African mind requires the reciprocal rebirthing of our African spiritness, the reciprocal rebirthing, the rebirthing of our spiritness as a person, the rebirthing of our spiritness as a community. And I would argue that some of this comes out of my work in Haiti during the earthquake, that you think about earthquakes have aftershocks, that the first aftershock for our minds was spirit trauma, where our spiritness was traumatized, and the pervasive and acute sense of alienation, the acute individual survival instinct, the loss of the sense of collective viability. The second aftershock, using the earthquake analogy, was the distortion of our human beingness, that notion of chattelization, the reinforced dependency on others, aggravated addiction to anything non-African, admiration of all things white, adoption of white power modalities and behavior. These are two aftershocks of the shattering of our minds due to colonialization and chattelization. They're aftershocks using the earthquake analogy. And so we have to reciprocally rebirth ourselves, rebirth the African spiritness, rebirthing a mutual interaction of using African wisdom, traditions, histories, culture, philosophy, and deep thought to illuminate our spiritness. I'm calling roots healing or radical healing, the process of tapping into the most fundamental, essential core root and source of inspiring health and wellness. And we do that in the medical system. We do that as revolutionaries in an attempt to talk about changing the nature of our life space and our governments. And all these things can become down in terms of specific things that I've laid out in terms of enhancing our sacred meanings. I spoke to these, advancing in terms of community, enhancing environment and ecological, respecting Mother Earth, advancing mixed use, socioeconomic, educational, spiritual complex, provide sense of security and safety, support self-reliance and entrepreneurial ventures, create development and enhancement activities, invent systems of community support that affirm Africanness, engage youth in youth-led beautification, revitalization, and recreation, defend programs of cross-cultural and intergenerational exchange, protect sense of unity and character. And so we can look at these and end up saying, look, the liberation of the African mind and the affirmation of African beingness requires these 13 disciplines. Understand being spirit, engage in visible and invisible, honor the feminine, enhance sacred meaning, enhance human potentiality, all the way down to maximizing an egalitarian lifestyle and proper nutrition, exercise, and spiritual evolution. All of us, academicians, civil servants, government officials, community activists, classroom teachers, advisors, administrators, business persons, entrepreneurs, workers, mamas and daddies, and especially revolutionaries, it seems to me, have to address these 13 disciplines if we are to liberate the African mind and affirm African beingness. And we do that, we have one last chance. We have one last chance. The world, because of COVID, the world is absolutely changing right under our feet. We have one last chance. We must continue our long and mighty walk in the sun with a different narrative of being spirit, being energy, being power. The worldwide African revolution to humanize the world is yet to be finished, and the ancestors required that we finish the job. We've come to complete that which is incomplete. The unfinished revolution is to be African, to be family, to be awesome. And it looks like that. Thank you all very much.